Commander Thexver stood before the holographic display of the third planet, its blue-green surface rotating slowly in the crimson light of the war chamber. The Korthic warhost had claimed 47 worlds in the past cycle, each conquest following the same predictable pattern: superior firepower, calculated intimidation, inevitable surrender. The species called humans would be no different. Initial scans confirmed standard defensive capabilities, reported Sub-Commander Yextil, her chitinous fingers dancing across the tactical interface. Primitive kinetic weapons, basic energy shields, scattered military installations. Their technology lags 3 centuries behind our standard arsenal. Thexver's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The humans had already proven their weakness by sending negotiation requests within hours of the warhost's arrival. Pathetic. Every conquered species had done the same. Initial bravado followed by desperate attempts at diplomacy. The Korthic had no interest in treaties, only submission. Deploy the standard intimidation protocol, Thexvar commanded, adjusting the ceremonial war scars that marked his rank. Begin with their largest population centers. Reduce 3 cities to ash. Then wait for their surrender transmission. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency. Thexver had personally overseen similar operations on the crystal cities of Vex Prime, the floating habitats of the Nereid Collective, and the underground warrens of the Mole King's domain. Each species had their unique architectural marvels, their proud histories, their sacred sites. None of it mattered when faced with the Korthic's overwhelming superiority. As the first bombardment commenced, Thexver watched the tactical display with detached interest. 3 human cities vanished in brilliant flashes, their deaths registering as statistical updates on his command screens. The humans would need time to process their loss, to understand the futility of resistance. By standard protocol, their surrender would arrive within 6 rotations, but something nagged at the edge of his consciousness as he studied the human communication frequencies. Where other species had fallen silent in shock, human transmissions were actually increasing. Not the panicked babble of a broken civilization, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like ... preparation. Commander Yextels. Voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. The humans are mobilizing additional military assets. They appear to be reinforcing the remaining positions rather than considering surrender terms. Thexver's confidence wavered for the first time in years. In 4 decades of conquest, no species had responded to the intimidation protocol with increased aggression. It defied all logic, all precedent. Perhaps these humans simply needed a more convincing demonstration of their helplessness. Double the bombardment, he ordered, his voice carrying across the bridge like a death sentence. Show them what happens to species that mistake stubbornness for courage. Asterisk, the second wave of destruction should have broken them. Thexver watched 6 more human cities disappear beneath orbital fire, their defensive grids crumbling like paper in a storm. Any rational species would have surrendered by now, their leaders scrambling to negotiate terms that might preserve some fragment of their civilization. Instead, the humans did something unprecedented. They attacked incoming vessels, shouted. The sensor operator, his voice cracking with disbelief. Multiple human craft, bearing directly for the flagship. Thexver studied the tactical display with growing bewilderment. The human ships were laughably outmatched primitive fusion drives against Korthic gravitic engines, crude missile systems against energy barriers that could deflect stellar radiation. It wasn't a battle. It was suicide with extra steps. Standard. Defensive posture, he commanded, though something in his chest felt oddly tight. Eliminate the attackers. The engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes. Human vessels exploded in brilliant fireballs as Korthic weapons carved through their hulls like heated blades through ice. Not a single enemy shot penetrated their defenses. It should have been a perfect demonstration of futility. But the humans kept coming. Wave after wave of ships emerged from the planet's gravity well, each group smaller and more desperate than the last. Converted cargo haulers bristling with improvised weapons. Civilian transports packed with explosives. Even single-pilot craft that could barely achieve orbital velocity. Their pilots screaming battle cries over open channels as they hurled themselves. At impossible odds. "They're not trying to win," whispered Yextil, staring at the carnage unfolding on her screens. "They can't be trying to win. This is just ... madness." Vexver said nothing, but his mandibles had stopped clicking. In 47 conquests, he had never witnessed anything like this. Every species fought to survive, to protect their people, to preserve their future. These humans seemed to be fighting for the sheer act of fighting itself, pouring their lives away like water through a broken dam. The final human ship was barely larger than an escape pod. Its pilot's transmission crackled through the bridge speakers. "For Sarah, for Chicago, for everyone you murdered, you bastards." A craft detonated against their shields in a flash of defiant fire dot in the sudden silence that followed. Dexfer realized something that made his blood run cold. The humans hadn't been trying to damage his ships. They had been trying to understand them. Each successive wave had probed different aspects of Korthic defenses, tested response times, analyzed weapon patterns. They had been learning, even as they died. "Sir," the communications officer's voice was barely above a whisper. "We're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. The humans, they want to negotiate." Relief flooded through Vexver's system. Finally, sanity had prevailed. The humans had recognized the inevitable and chosen survival over pointless sacrifice. He straightened his war scarves with renewed confidence. "Put them through," he commanded. "Let's hear their surrender terms." But the human face that appeared on the main screen wore no expression of defeat. The female's eyes held something far more dangerous than despair. They held understanding. "Greetings, Commander Vexver," she said, her voice steady despite the smoke and fire visible behind her. "I'm General Martinez, commanding what's left of Earth's defense forces. We've learned everything we need to know about your capabilities. Now it's time to show you ours." General Martinez's words echoed in Vexver's mind as he watched the tactical display transform into something beyond his comprehension. The humans weren't surrendering. They were evolving. In the span of mere rotations, their entire military doctrine had shifted from conventional warfare to something that defied every strategic principle he had ever learned. "Commander, they're using their own cities as weapons," reported the tactical officer, his voice strained with disbelief. "Detroit, Los Angeles, Moscow, they're detonating nuclear devices within their own population centers as our forces approach." Vexver stared at the readings, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. No species destroyed their own cities to deny them to an enemy. The losses were catastrophic, the strategic value negligible. It was the kind of decision that no rational military mind would ever contemplate. But it was working. His ground forces, expecting to occupy intact infrastructure and terrified populations, instead found themselves navigating radioactive wastelands, where human survivors fought from the rubble with weapons cobbled together from the debris of their own civilization. They weren't trying to win territory anymore. They were making every square meter too expensive to hold. "The Melbourne garrison reports complete loss of contact," Yextil announced, her chitinous hands trembling as she processed the incoming data. "The humans. They collapsed an entire subway system while our troops were inside. Buried themselves alive just to take out one company." Each report was more impossible than the last. Humans using their own hospitals as bomb factories. Parents sending their children into battle while they stayed behind to trigger demolition charges. Entire cities choosing collective death over subjugation, leaving behind nothing but poisoned ground and radiation signatures that spelled out final messages of defiance. "They're not fighting to win," Exfer whispered, the words feeling foreign. In his mouth, "They're fighting to ensure nobody can win." The communication channel crackled to life again. General Martinez's face appeared, now bearing fresh scars and a haunted expression that somehow made her more terrifying rather than less. "Having second thoughts, Commander?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge that made his carapace crawl. "We've got another 100 cities ready to go dark. Moscow was just the warm-up. Want to see what we do with New York? You're destroying your own species." Dexfer snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Your children, your culture, your future, you're throwing it all away for nothing." Martinez's smile was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. "Nothing? Commander, we're teaching the galaxy's greatest conqueror the most important lesson of all. There are some victories that cost more than defeats, and we're going to make sure this is one of them." Behind her, Dexfer could see human soldiers preparing for what looked like another suicidal assault. But their faces held no desperation, no fear of death. They looked almost eager, as if they had discovered something in the Komite mathematics of mutual destruction that filled them with purpose. Asterisk. "You can't win this way," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even if you make this planet uninhabitable, the Korthik war host will claim 1,000 others. Will you?" Martinez asked, tilting her head like a predator studying prey. "Because the entire galaxy is watching this battle, Commander. Every species you've conquered, every world you've claimed. They're all learning the same lesson we learned. Sometimes the best way to beat a stronger enemy isn't to defeat them. It's to become too dangerous to fight." The tactical display showed Korthok forces retreating from another city as the humans triggered yet another radiological event. His casualty reports were climbing toward levels that hadn't been seen since the war host's early campaigns against technologically equal opponents. But these weren't technological equals. These were primitives with fusion weapons and an apparent death wish. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The war had been raging for 30 rotations when Nexver first heard the laughter. It came through the communication channels during a particularly brutal engagement in what the humans called Sector 7, a sprawling urban zone that his forces had been trying to secure for 8 days. The sound was wrong, fundamentally wrong, in a way that made his compound eyes water. Human soldiers, surrounded by overwhelming firepower and facing certain death, were laughing. "Audio from the battlefield, Commander," the communications officer reported, his voice barely steady. "The humans in Sector 7. They're requesting permission to trigger something called Option Omega." Exfer watched the tactical display as his forces closed in on the final human stronghold. 300 Korthik warriors against perhaps 50 remaining human defenders. It should have been a massacre. Instead, those 50 humans were giggling like younglings at a celebration. "General Martinez, to all human forces," came the transmission, clear and bright with barely contained glee. "Option Omega is approved. Gentlemen, ladies, and everything in between, it's been an honor serving with you. See you all in hell." The explosion that followed wasn't nuclear. It wasn't chemical. It was something far worse, a cascade failure in the city's power grid that somehow managed to take out not just the human position, but half of Vexver's advancing force and 3 city blocks of infrastructure. The humans had turned their own power source into a weapon, apparently just to see if they could. "How is this possible?" Yextil whispered, staring at the damage reports. They had no strategic advantage to gain. That position was already lost. But Dexfer was beginning to understand something that chilled him to his core. The humans weren't fighting battles anymore. They were conducting experiments. Each engagement was a test of some new form of creative self-destruction, as if they were competing with themselves to find increasingly spectacular ways to die, while taking as many Korthic with them as possible. In the ruins of Tokyo, they had weaponized their subway system, turning kilometers of tunnels into a pressure bomb that claimed an entire Korthic regiment. In Snow Paulo, they had somehow convinced their planetary ecosystem to reject Korthok. Atmospheric processors, creating a biological weapon that targeted his species' respiratory systems. In London, they had turned their financial district into a maze of gravitational anomalies using modified mining equipment. None of it made sense. None of it followed the rules of warfare that had governed galactic conflict for millennia. And none of it should have worked. But it was all working perfectly. Commander, the tactical officer's voice was thin with exhaustion and something approaching terror. We're receiving reports from across the sector. The Vexian colonies are... They're asking questions about human defensive strategies. The Nereid Collective is requesting information about Option Omega protocols. Even the Mole Kings are inquiring about urban tunnel systems. Dexfer felt something crack inside his chest. The other species, the ones the Korthic had already conquered, were studying human tactics, learning from them. The war wasn't just about one planet anymore. It was becoming a template, a blueprint for how to make conquest so costly that even victory became defeat. "Sir, incoming transmission from Earth," the communications officer announced. It's General Martinez again." The human's face peered on the main screen, but she looked different now. Older, scarred, with an expression that belonged on the face of someone who had seen the edge of the universe and decided to push a little further. "Hello again, Commander," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that was somehow more terrifying than anger. "I wanted to thank you for something. This war has taught us something wonderful about ourselves. We always wondered what we were capable of when everything was on the line. Now we know." Behind her, Dexfer could see humans working on something. Massive and incomprehensible, a structure that seemed to bend light around its edges and hum with barely contained energy. "We've been thinking," Martinez continued, "about what happens after Earth, about all those other worlds you mentioned, all those species you've conquered. We've been sending them care packages, you might say, technical specifications, philosophical treatises, instruction manuals." "What are you talking about?" Dexfer demanded, though part of him already knew. Martinez's smile was radiant with the joy of someone who had finally found their purpose in the universe. "We're teaching them how to be human, Commander. How to laugh in the face of impossible odds. How to make victory cost more than defeat. How to become too dangerous to conquer." The structure behind her pulsed once, and every sensor on Dexfor's flagship screamed in harmonious terror. "We call it the martyrdom engine," Martinez said conversationally. "One planet's worth of spite compressed into a single moment of perfect." "Spite? Want to see how it works?" The martyrdom engine defied every law of physics that Dexver understood, and several that he was fairly certain didn't exist. It sat in what had once been the Sahara Desert, a writhing mass of human engineering that seemed to fold space around itself like origami made from the fabric of reality. The energy readings were impossible, not just dangerous, but mathematically incoherent. "It's not a weapon," whispered his chief scientist, studying the sensor data with the wide-eyed fascination of someone watching their own death approach. I don't know what it is. The humans have built something that shouldn't be able to exist." Dexver stared at the readings, feeling something he had never experienced in 4 decades of conquest. Not fear of death, he had faced that countless times. Not fear of defeat, every warrior understood that possibility. This was something deeper, more primal. This was the fear of encountering something that made all concepts of victory and defeat completely meaningless. "General Martinez," he said into the communication channel, his voice steady despite the growing certainty that he was already dead. "What have you done?" The human's face appeared on screen one final time. She looked peaceful now, almost serene, like someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had been bothering her for years. "We figured it out, Commander," she said softly. "The thing we've been trying to understand this whole war. You see, every other species in the galaxy fights to win something: territory, resources, survival, dominance. But humans? We've discovered we're uniquely capable of fighting for nothing at all, just for the sake of fighting, just to prove it can be done." The martyrdom engine pulsed again, and Exver felt his ship's artificial gravity fluctuate in response. Whatever the humans had built, it was affecting space-time itself, creating ripples that propagated faster than light and carried implications that his mind couldn't fully process. "This device," Martinez continued, gesturing toward the impossible structure behind her, represents the culmination of human logic applied to its ultimate extreme. If we can't have victory, and we can't accept defeat, then we'll simply opt out of the entire concept. We'll make this war so fundamentally destructive that it becomes a cautionary tale for every species in the galaxy. "You'll destroy yourselves," Thexfer said, though he already knew how pointless the observation was. "Yes," Martinez agreed cheerfully. "Along with you, your fleet, this solar system, and if our calculations are correct, approximately 47 light-years of local space-time. We're going to create a dead zone so absolute that nothing will ever be able to exist here again. Not matter, not energy, not even the possibility of existence." Thexfer understood then, with the crystal clarity that comes just before death, exactly why he had never encountered anything like humanity before. Most species that developed this kind of self-destructive capability destroyed themselves long before they reached the stars. The humans had somehow managed to skip that step, preserving their essential madness until the moment when they could use it most effectively. "The other species you conquered," Martinez said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality, "they're all watching this, learning from our example. By the time the martyrdom engine finishes its work, every world in the galaxy will understand. The most important lesson we can teach: some things are worse than death, some defeats are more valuable than victory, and some enemies are too dangerous to fight, not because they're strong, but because they're willing to break everything, including themselves, to deny you what you want." The tactical display showed Korthic fleets throughout the sector suddenly changing course, abandoning their conquests and fleeing toward deep space. But Thexfer knew it was already too late. The humans had won in the most absolute way possible by ensuring that victory itself became meaningless. "Commander," Martinez said, her image beginning to flicker as the martyrdom engine reached critical resonance, "I want you to know that this isn't personal. You seem like a decent enough conqueror, as these things go, but we needed to send a message to the universe, and sometimes the messenger has to become part of the message." The last thing Thexfer saw before the cascade began was Martinez's face, illuminated by the light of her species' ultimate act of defiance. She was still smiling, even as reality began to unravel around her, even as she and every human on Earth chose collective extinction over submission. In the microsecond before the wave front reached his flagship, Thexfer finally understood what he had been fighting. Not a species, not a civilization, but an idea made manifest, the idea that some principles were worth any price, including the price of existence itself. The humans had taught the galaxy to fear not their strength, but their absolute refusal to accept any outcome that didn't include the destruction of their enemy's capacity to threaten others. They had become a cautionary tale written in the fundamental forces of the universe, a warning that would echo through space-time for millennia. Beware the species that would rather break reality than bend the knee. The fear that Thexfer felt in his final moment wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of having awakened something in the galaxy that could never be put back to sleep. Somewhere out there, on 1,000 conquered worlds, other species were learning to be human, learning to laugh at impossible odds, learning to make victory cost more than defeat. The Korthic warhost would never conquer another world. Not because they lacked the strength, but because the humans had taught the galaxy that there were fates worse than conquest, and some species were crazy enough to choose them God in the end. Humanity's greatest victory wasn't defeating their conquerors. It was teaching the universe itself to fear what desperate creatures could accomplish when they stopped caring about survival and started caring about the message their destruction would send. The wave front consumed everything, leaving behind a sphere of absolute nothingness that would serve as humanity's tombstone and their gift to galactic civilization. A reminder that some wars can only be won by making sure nobody survives to collect the prize.